welcome. So you've brought in some really interesting material for us to look at today, all centered around, well, how we learn, how we get better, and eventually how we achieve mastery in something.
Yeah, that's the core of it.
And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to pull out the main ideas, the actionable stuff from these sources to maybe help you, the listener, learn a bit more effectively.
Exactly. We want to unpack those principles.
We're planning to dig into the learning process itself, definitely touch on some learning theories. I think specifically that entity versus incremental idea.
That's a key one. Dweck's work, yeah.
Right. And then get into mastery, what that really means, and also the practical side training practice, that concept of making smaller circles.
And interval work, too, which is fascinating how that applies.
Yeah. And I think a key thing we're aiming for is this idea that becoming a master, it's not just piling up facts, is it? It's about transforming that knowledge into something, well, deeper, almost intuitive.
That's a great way to put it. It becomes part of you. Let's dive in.
Okay. So first off, it's kind of striking how top performers, they often don't really talk about the basics, do they?
No, not explicitly. It's because those fundamentals, they become second nature. They're just there,
Right.
operating under the surface, almost unconsciously.
Right.
And that internalization itself, well, that's actually a huge part of what mastery is.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me of Josh Waitskin's big realization, that his real skill wasn't just chess or later Tai Chi.
But part of learning itself.
Exactly. The process of getting good at things. Why is that perspective shift so, well, powerful?
Well, I think it's because it forces you to see the common threads. It highlights this core principle. You have to break down these big, complex things into, smaller, manageable steps incrementally. Waitskin found that when he had to teach chess basics, it actually made him deconstruct his own expert knowledge. He had to unpack what had become automatic for him.
So it helps the beginner, obviously, but it also clarifies things for the expert, too.
Yeah.
Like shining a light on the building blocks.
Precisely. It reveals the mechanics, the how behind the expertise.
Interesting. Almost like reverse engineering your own skill. And you mentioned this process also led to a change in focus for Waitskin, moving away from just winning.
Yeah, toward actually loving the process, the study, the training itself, not just the outcome.
How does loving the process help you get to mastery? It's a bit soft, maybe.
Well, it builds resilience, doesn't it? Waitskin noticed, and it's pretty common, that lots of people start out enthusiastic, but then they hit roadblocks, get discouraged, and, well, they quit. If you genuinely enjoy the journey, the ups and downs of learning, you have that staying power. You can navigate the setbacks, and that resilience is really important when we look at different mindsets about learning.
Okay, let's go there. You mentioned Dr. Carol Dweck's work, entity versus incremental theorists. What's the main difference?
So entity theorists, they tend to believe that things like intelligence or ability in a certain area are basically fixed traits. You're either good at math or you're not. Often stems from, early labels or easy successes.
I'm just smart at this, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And their view of success or failure is tied directly to that perceived fixed level of talent. Incremental theorists, though, they're different. They believe abilities are built, developed through hard work, dedication, strategy.
So for them, effort is the key ingredient.
Effort is the path to mastery, not some innate gift.
Okay, those sound like fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. How does that play out when things get difficult?
That's where it gets really interesting. The entity theorists, even the ones who think they are smart, can actually be, more fragile when they face a real challenge.
Fragile? How so?
Because their whole self-image is often tied up in being smart or talented. So a really difficult task, one they might fail at, that feels like a threat.
A threat to their identity.
Pretty much. The fear of not looking smart, of failing to live up to that image, it can lead them to feel helpless or just avoid the challenge altogether.
Wow, so a setback isn't just feedback. It's like proof they weren't that smart after all.
In a way, yeah. Whereas the incremental theorists, they see challenges differently. It's an opportunity. A tough problem isn't a threat. It's a chance to learn something new, to stretch themselves.
They see it as part of the process.
Exactly. They tend to attribute the outcome, success, or failure more to their effort or strategy, not some fixed ability. Failure is just, temporary feedback. Okay, that approach didn't work. Let's try something else.
That really highlights how much mindset matters in just sticking with something.
Yeah.
How does this then connect to, the actual path to becoming a master?
Okay, so this fits perfectly with Waitskin's idea of numbers to leave numbers, or form to leave form.
Right, I remember reading that. What does it mean exactly?
It's about drilling down on the fundamentals, the basics, the numbers or the form so deeply, so thoroughly that they become completely intuitive, baked in, unconscious almost.
You don't have to think about them anymore.
Precisely. Think about, say, learning multiplication tables. At first, you're consciously calculating, right? 7 times 8 is 56. You're using the numbers.
Right.
But eventually, hopefully, it just becomes automatic. You just know it. You've left the explicit calculation behind. The understanding is deeper. That's the principle.
Okay, so it's like a musician internalizing scales so they can just improvise, or a writer internalizing grammar so they can focus on the story.
Exactly that kind of transformation. And it's not instant, obviously. It's built up, as Waitzkin says, layer by layer. You slowly deepen your understanding. Foundational rules transform into creative insight.
And the key is grasping the why behind things, the underlying principles, not just specific examples.
Yes, understanding those operating principles is crucial. It lets you develop a broader feel for the whole subject, not just isolated bits of knowledge.
Waitzkin also mentioned something called progressive summarization. Is that related to this layering?
It is, yeah. While maybe not the main focus here, it's a technique for basically distilling information down to its absolute essence over time. You review, you summarize the summary.
Okay.
Each pass helps you internalize the core ideas more deeply, building those layers needed for real mastery.
So mastery isn't just about knowing a lot of stuff. It's about this depth, this internalization that lets you perform smoothly, intuitively, based on that inner understanding, not constantly checking the rule book.
You've got it. And that's critical because, as Waitzkin points out, when the pressure's on, what do we default to?
Our deepest habits.
Our most ingrained habits, exactly.
Yeah.
So if those fundamentals aren't rock solid, deeply internalized, that's when performance cracks under pressure.
Which leads to this kind of paradoxical idea he mentioned, learning becomes unlearning. That sounds weird.
It does sound counterintuitive, right? But what it means is, as you reach true expertise, you're no longer rigidly bound by the rules you first learned.
You move beyond them.
You develop a nuanced intuition. You know when to apply the rule, when to bend it, maybe even when a completely counterintuitive move is the right one, based on that deep, layered understanding.
So you unlearn the rigid application of the rules because your understanding is now more flexible, more profound.
Exactly. It's moving from conscious rule following to this, embodied, almost unconscious competence.
And outsiders might just see that intuition and think, wow, they're naturally talented. They don't see the years of layering and internalizing the rules first.
Precisely. Which brings us to, how do we actually build this? Through training and practice. And Waitzkin has a really key point here. Yeah. We have to be able to do something slowly.
Before we can have any hope of doing it correctly with speed. Yeah, I noted that one. Makes sense. You can't build a skyscraper on shaky foundations.
Right. You need that deliberate, focused, often slow work on the basics first.
And then he talks about making smaller circles. What's the essence of that concept?
It's about refinement. Taking the, let's say, physical mechanics of a skill and condensing them, refining them, until it's less about conscious steps and more about an internal feeling of doing it right.
An internal feeling.
Yeah. Think about a really good golf swing. Beginners think about their grip, their stance, backswing, downswing, lots of separate parts. But a pro, it's often condensed into one smooth motion that feels right to them. Or like Waitzkin's example of a trained singer knowing the precise physical sensation of hitting a note perfectly. It's an internal calibration.
Okay, so it's a bit like chunking, grouping small actions into bigger units, but with this added layer of, sensory or even emotional feedback, this, that felt right component.
Exactly. It leads to that deeper tacit knowledge. You just know internally when it's correct. And this is huge because it means you can perform reliably even when the external situation is messy or the feedback isn't clear. You trust that internal sense.
It's not just relying on outside cues.
Right. And achieving this often means focusing on depth over breadth, especially early on, really mastering a few fundamental techniques deeply rather than superficially learning many. That's where you tap into those unconscious, intangible, and creative components he talks about.
He also brings up being at peace with imperfection during this process. That seems important too.
Oh, absolutely critical, because learning is messy. Instead of getting derailed by mistakes or external problems, the idea is to use them as creative fuel.
How so?
Well, an obstacle forces you to find an internal solution, maybe a different approach you hadn't considered. It pushes innovation. Setbacks become learning opportunities, not reasons to quit.
That connects back to the incremental mindset, doesn't it? Seeing challenges as fuel.
Definitely.
He mentioned his first chess teacher, Bruce, really hammering this home, focusing on the why behind moves, developing a feeling for the game.
Yeah, Bruce's method sounds like it was all about slowing down the thinking process, asking questions, not just giving answers.
Like, why that move? What else could you do? What's the threat?
Exactly. Forcing a deeper consideration of the whole thought process, the alternatives, the consequences, the order of things. It wasn't about rote memorization. It was about building that foundational intuitive understanding, that feeling.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly to interval work. This sounds like something from sports training, but Waitskin seems to apply it more broadly.
He definitely does. He argues that mastering the rhythm of stress and recovery is absolutely key for any kind of peak performance, mental or physical.
Stress and recovery, like push, then rest.
Sort of, yeah. He mentions findings, presumably from performance science, showing a strong link. For instance, how cardiovascular interval training bursts of high intensity followed by recovery doesn't just help your body, it actually improves your ability to mentally recover too, to release tension quickly after focused effort.
So there's a real mind-body connection there. Training your body to recover helps your mind recover.
Or that seems to be the idea.
Yeah.
And he suggests that with consistent incremental training in this way, your recovery time, mentally and physically, can become incredibly fast. Almost instantaneous.
So interval work isn't just about physical conditioning, it's the practice of managing that stress recovery cycle.
Yes, exactly. Practicing the ebb and flow. And this principle applies whether you're, a top athlete or just trying to manage cognitive load during a demanding workday. Better recovery leads to better endurance and performance when things get tough.
And he used this himself in martial arts. Short, intense rounds, short breaks.
Yeah, his example was 1-minute rounds with 1-minute breaks. The goal wasn't just the exertion, it was specifically training the body and mind to recover rapidly and be ready for the next burst, conditioning the system for quick turnaround.
That makes a lot of sense. And that ability to recover quickly, to reset, seems really linked to maintaining presence, right? Especially under pressure. He warns about the downward spiral.
Oh yeah, the downward spiral. We've all been there, haven't we? You make one mistake.
And then suddenly everything goes wrong. You panic, make another mistake, get flustered.
Exactly, that snowball effect. And his point is crucial. The first mistake is rarely the killer. It's the reaction to it, the dwelling on it, the loss of focus, the emotional hijacking. That's what causes the real damage.
So the key is breaking that chain reaction.
Yes. Regaining presence immediately after an error. He suggests things like, a conscious deep breath, maybe splashing cold water on your face, some kind of physical reset. Whatever works to interrupt that negative feedback loop.
Get back to the present moment instead of being stuck mentally on the error you just made.
Right, because dwelling on the past mistake creates this, mental detachment. It pulls you out of the flow, makes you unable to respond effectively to what's happening now, being present to what is, not frozen in what was.
Which leads us naturally to resilience, doesn't it? Bouncing back.
Absolutely. It's about seeing every experience, good or bad, as data, as something to draw wisdom from for the long haul, keeping that long-term growth perspective, even when you're in the thick of it.
So obstacles shouldn't stop you. They should actually, what was the phrase? Spur you to creative new angles.
Yeah, and setbacks should deepen your resolve. It's that reframing again. Challenges aren't blockers. They're catalysts for deeper learning or stronger commitment.
He even mentioned using injury time, like physical recovery, as a chance to work on other things. Mental game, technical study.
Right. Shifting focus constructively. And he talks about transitions, moments of change, whether it's a shift in momentum in a chess game or a change in life circumstances. The importance of clearing the mind, adapting, not getting stuck in the previous phase.
It feels like all these threads, internalization, intuition, resilience, presence, they all kind of weave together towards this idea of mastery involving the unconscious mind.
Very much so. That numbers to leave numbers idea. It's fundamentally about drilling things in so deeply that they become accessible to the unconscious, leading to those bursts of insight he describes.
How does that work, though, the unconscious insight?
Well, the thinking is when your knowledge base is really deeply interconnected, your brain gets incredibly efficient at filtering. It can subconsciously recognize patterns, pull relevant information, and make intuitive leaps that your conscious, linear thinking might just miss.
So even if we can't fully measure or explain intuition empirically, it's clearly a vital part of high-level performance.
Definitely shouldn't be dismissed just because it's hard to pin down. Waitskin uses that analogy of a camera's shutter speed, remember?
Yeah, explain that again.
The idea is a master's mind, because so much processing is handled efficiently and unconsciously based on deep training, can effectively perceive more within the same slice of time. It's like their mental shutter speed is faster, they can take in the scene, process it, and react, while the conscious mind remains relatively calm and focused. It feels like time slows down.
So it's not necessarily thinking faster in a frantic way, but thinking more effectively, more deeply integrated, freeing up conscious attention.
Exactly. With true mastery, that whole network of knowledge, the principles, the patterns, the chunks of skill, it's also integrated that accessing it becomes almost instantaneous, often below the level of conscious awareness.
Wow. Okay, this has been a really fascinating exploration, really digging into what goes into learning and mastery.
It really has. And I think the big takeaway, if we boil it down, is that genuine mastery isn't just about stuffing your head with information. It's about that deep internalization, cultivating intuition, and really embracing the whole journey, the focused practice, yes, but also the recovery, the resilience, the constant growth.
So for everyone listening, maybe take a moment to think about that entity versus incremental distinction. Where do you fall? Do you tend to see your abilities as more fixed or as something you can actively develop? How might that be affecting your own learning?
Yeah, that's a great reflection point. And maybe also think about a skill you're working on right now. Is there an area where you could apply that making smaller circles idea? Really focus on refining one small aspect until it feels right internally.
And maybe one final thought to leave you with. If mastery eventually means kind of unlearning or transcending the rigid rules, what's a fundamental principle in your own field, your own life, that you're working to internalize so deeply that it becomes second nature beyond conscious thought?
Something to chew on.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.